You perhaps often hear people say a country is doing well or not so well. How do we tell if a country is doing well? We will look at the national income, but what is national income and how do we measure the national income? There are several ways to measure a nation's income. Let's start off with the most straightforward one, the GDP, Gross Domestic Product. GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within the country during a calendar year. The formula to calculate GDP is as shown. Take the current prices of goods or services produced, multiply by the quantity produced, and we add up all these figures for all goods and services produced. Please note that GDP only includes goods and services produced within the country's geographical boundaries. It does not matter if the producer is a local or a foreigner. Only goods produced in the current year are included in the current year GDP. It does not matter if the goods are sold. This means GDP tracks productions and not sales. Finally, note that GDP is expressed in monetary terms. So only goods sold in formal markets are included in the computation of GDP. We will go into greater details about these points laterwards. Now, GDP excludes illegal transactions like illegal gambling, drug trafficking, etc. because it is impossible to keep track of it. Non-market transactions like do-it-yourself activities are excluded from GDP because we cannot put a value to these activities as no similar products exist in the market. However, owner-occupied housing and food grown and consumed by farmers are included in the GDP because their values can be gauged by looking at similar items sold in the market. Second-hand transactions are excluded from GDP. Remember that the GDP for the current year records only production in the current year. Any sale of used goods or second-hand goods are not counted in the current year GDP because it was already counted back in the time it was produced. A flat built in 2007 is counted in 2007's GDP. If the unit is sold this year, we do not include it in this year's GDP. Counting the values again in the current year would overstate the GDP. Lastly, non-productive financial transactions are excluded from the GDP. Note that non-productive financial transactions are transactions where there is a transfer of funds but nothing is produced out of it. This includes donations, welfare benefits from the government, lottery winnings, paper transactions which are sales and purchases of bonds and shares. It should be noted, however, that second-hand and pure financial transactions are excluded from the GDP, but any services provided in relation to the transactions, such as agents, banks, and brokers, are recorded in the current year's GDP because current services are performed. Let's move on to the second concept, GDP per capita. Simply stated, GDP per capita is the average GDP per person. It is calculated by taking the GDP divided by the total population. Now, why do we use GDP per capita? Let's make a comparison between GDP and GDP per capita. GDP alone indicates the size of the economy. On the other hand, GDP per capita indicates the country's living standards. To illustrate an example, if a country has a GDP of $1 trillion, is the country's living standard good? It depends. Consider the case if the country's population is 1 billion. How about 100 million? Most importantly, you should note that GDP per capita accounts for the population in the country. Remember that even if GDP increases, but the population increases as well, the living standard may be relatively constant or even declining. That's why GDP per capita is a better measure of the country's well-being or living standards. Apart from GDP, we can also use the GNP, Gross National Product, to gauge national income. GNP is defined as a market value of all final goods and services produced by the citizens of a country. The definition of GDP and GNP may sound similar, but you need to know the key difference. Let's compare the definitions side by side. I hope you realize that GDP counts goods and services produced within the country's geographical boundaries, whereas GNP counts goods and services produced by the country's citizens. Let's say we have a Singaporean firm that ventured into USA. Where would the production made by the Singaporean firm in the US be included? Singapore's GDP, Singapore's GNP, USA's GDP, or USA's GNP? It will be recorded in Singapore's GNP and USA's GDP. It is recorded in Singapore's GNP because the Singaporean firm is run by a Singaporean. On the other hand, it is recorded in USA's GDP because the firm is in USA and the production is made in USA. GDP and GNP are linked in the following manner. GNP equals GDP plus net factor receipt. Based on the definitions of GDP and GNP, would you like to make a guess? What is the net factor receipt? Well, it is equal to production by residents overseas less production by foreigners in the country. Does it make sense to you? If not, please check back the definitions again. GNP includes overseas production by its own citizens and excludes local productions by foreigners, whereas GDP includes local production by foreigners and excludes overseas production by its own citizens. Before we move on to the next concept, take some time to think about this. The main function of an economy is to produce output. If production is increasing over time, the economy is deemed doing well. Now, if GDP increases, can we be certain that production has increased? Can we conclude that the economy is performing better? Recall the formula of GDP, the sum of current price multiplied by current quantity. What can cause the GDP to increase? Both the price and quantity can. Let me illustrate an example to show you what I mean. This is the data about a hypothetical economy. For simplicity, let's say it only produced rice and tea. The prices and quantities for the year 2014 and 2015 are provided. Based on the formula, calculate the GDP for this economy for the 2 years. Did you get the following answer? Anyway, at first glance, you might think, wow, GDP have more than doubled over the 2 years. Production must have doubled. Is that so? Let's look at the individual quantity produced. For rice, it has increased by only 20% if you do the calculation, and for tea, it has increased by only around 8%. This is not right. It is not possible for production to double. This is the issue with the straightforward GDP we have learned, commonly known as nominal GDP. The nominal GDP have overstated true production activity and economic well-being during inflation. We often want to compare production of an economy over a time period. Hence, we need an indicator that does not capture changes in price. This indicator is called the real gross domestic product. Real GDP is measured in constant dollars, which is the prices of a constant year called the base year. Please look at the formula for real GDP. Price B is the price of the goods or services during the base year. Assuming 2014 is the base year, we look at the prices of 2014 in the computation of real GDP for 2015. We also use the prices of 2014 in the computation of real GDP for 2016 and all other years. This prevents the real GDP from capturing price changes. When real GDP changes, we can conclude that production have changed. Let's go back to our previous example. Assume 2014 is the base year. Calculate the economy's real GDP for the 2 years. Did you get this value? Now, the real GDP for 2015 seems to more reasonably reflect changes in production. With the real GDP, we can gauge if the economy is producing better or growing. Remember that when an economy is growing, it is producing more. The formula for economic growth is quite straightforward. It is simply the percentage change in the real GDP for the current year over the previous year. I repeat, we use real GDP and not nominal GDP because real GDP does not capture price changes as the price of the base year is used in the computation of real GDP for all the years. If real GDP increased, we are certain that output have increased. This is not the case for nominal GDP because prices can increase and this will overstate the economy's performance. We have 3 possible cases. The real GDP for the current year could be higher than the previous year. The economy is said to be enjoying an economic growth. The real GDP for the current year can also be lower than the previous year. The economy is deemed suffering from a recession. Alternatively, the real GDP for the current year could be the same as the previous year. This situation is known as economic stagnation. Back to our example again. What is the economic growth rate for the year 2015? If you are correct in your calculations, you should get a positive value of 15%. The economy is growing. Production have increased by 15% in 2015 compared to 2014. One way to measure price changes is the GDP price deflator. We simply take the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP and multiply that by 100. Try to calculate the GDP price deflator for 2015. Did you get 182? More importantly, do you know how to interpret the index? A GDP price deflator of 182 means prices in 2015 is around 82% more expensive than prices in the base year, which is 2014.